So there are really two key points that I want to highlight in talking about the differential impacts on developing countries. One is that there is a great power imbalance between the countries that are negotiating trade agreements, which affects the ability of low and middle income countries to negotiate agreements that really reflect their interests. And that these asymmetries in power between countries negotiating leads to agreements which disproportionately affect low and middle income countries. And I want to use the case of RCEP, which I was just talking about before, and access to medicines to sort of highlight this issue. So it's the case that countries that are wealthy, that have large economies and markets that other countries want to get access to, are in much better negotiating positions and are able to exercise a significant amount of power in negotiations. And an often cited example, which Deb just touched on, is the World Trade Organization's trade-related aspects of intellectual property rights agreement. So an agreement that brought in 20-year patents for intellectual property rights and was opposed by several low and middle income countries. They really didn't want to agree to this agreement. So how did it come about? So there were several factors, but a couple worth highlighting here that we're seeing repeat in the regional and bilateral trade agreements is that some states can exercise a significant amount of power. And the way that the United States did it in the TRIPS agreement was that it decided to increase tariffs on the imports from countries that it saw as opposing its position in the negotiations. So countries like India that were seen to try and resist what the US wanted then saw an increase on their an increase in tariffs on countries on the exports that they were trying to get into the US. So there was a significant amount of economic power that the US used to say, if you disagree with us, if you make this difficult for us, we're going to make it harder for you or more expensive for you to trade with us. And there's a recent book that's come out by Brazil's former trade negotiator during the time of TRIPS, who said that developing countries faced threats like suspension of international financing if they didn't sign on to the agreement. So it wasn't just threats that they might have difficulty getting into the US market, but that they might not be able to access financing from the international financing bodies if they weren't to go along with what the United States and the European Commission wanted. It was also the case in the TRIPS agreement that major pharmaceutical companies were lobbying and playing a key role in lobbying different governments to try and get what they wanted. So they were saying that if you don't agree to this agreement, we're not going to be investing in research and development in your country. We're going to have to go to other countries. So there's this fear of capital flight, this fear that if you don't go along with what the major corporations want, then they won't be coming and investing and providing jobs in your country. So there was like sort of dynamic of significant amounts of pressure coming in on developing countries, which led to some countries saying, okay, we're going to go ahead with this. And it sort of led to a weakening of the developing country position. And we can see this power imbalance play out in the turn to bilateral and regional trade agreements that we've touched on today, in that we have agreements that are being negotiated by a smaller amount of countries. And we're seeing smaller groups of countries where we have states that have significant economies like the United States or Japan, and then smaller players, countries with much smaller economies. And really it's sort of like a divide and conquer strategy, where it's much harder for a country to resist pressure if it is sort of negotiating with very powerful actors and it doesn't have a large group of developing countries sort of acting together as a bloc. And we can see this in the case of the TPP. So Deb was highlighting how the countries negotiating the TPP, there's a significant difference in terms of their wealth and their GDP. And countries like Vietnam, for example, were forced to agree to, if they wanted to sign the TPP, they had to agree to some provisions around intellectual property that would be very, very bad for access to medicines in Vietnam. They did it because they thought maybe they could get some better access to export markets, but they were really pressured when you're looking at, there were very few middle-income countries that could band together. And as a result, they don't get agreement that sort of reflects the best interests that they have. And we can also see this sort of issues arising in RCEP. So, as I mentioned earlier, RCEP was initially framed as an agreement that would reflect the interests of the low and middle income countries. But we've seen leaked text online that's showing that Japan and South Korea are attempting to bring in certain intellectual property rules and standards that are in the TPP that would be very disastrous for many of the low and middle income countries. And we did a study which we've just published in the Asia Pacific Journal of Public Health, and I've brought some copies here because I know that the graphs are not very clear, but we were looking at the low and middle income countries that are negotiating RCEP that are not in part of the TPP, and if they were to agree to these kind of IP standards and settings, what it might mean for their public health and access to medicines. And we found that all of these countries would really have to change their domestic IP laws, and that this is going to have a significant flow-on effect in terms of their ability to access generics, for generics to get on the market faster, and we know that generics cost less. So what does it mean for countries that have smaller health budgets, countries where patients are more likely to be paying out of pocket for their medicines, and where poor access to medicines really has life or death consequences? One final point I wanted to make when we're talking about, I guess, the battle between countries and the power imbalances and the role of pharmaceutical companies coming in and trying to pressure, is that civil society organisations really can play a role in trying to support low and middle income countries and to raising the public health issues and putting them on the agenda in the public sphere and in the media. And this was the case, as Deb mentioned, around the World Trade Organization, that there was a declaration in 2001 which reaffirmed that developing countries had a right to protect their public health, and part of that came about because of mass mobilisation of civil society, groups like Doctors Without Borders, who've really raised the profile of these trade agreements and what they might mean for their countries. So I think that I wanted to end the note that, yes, it's quite challenging looking at the power that some companies have, but we can fight that, and there's plenty of examples where we have done that, and we can keep doing that. So hopefully you will join us in our fight for public health in trade agreements. Thank you.